"The old man should have just stayed home and minded his business," my daughter-in-law said, raising her wine glass with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We were all so worried about you making that drive alone, Walter." She said it sweetly. She always said everything sweetly. I looked at her across the Thanksgiving table, her perfectly pressed blazer, her carefully arranged expression, the way her hand rested on my son's arm like a claim, and I thought about the folder sitting in my truck. The one I'd printed at the Staples on Highway 11 2 days before. The one with her name on it, and her other name, and the account number she didn't know I knew about. I smiled back at her. "You're right," I said. "I probably should have." My son laughed. He reached over and squeezed my hand. He had no idea. Neither did she not yet that the drive I'd taken alone wasn't a mistake. It was the last piece I needed. My name is Walter Kowalski. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years with the Ontario Provincial Police, the last 14 as a financial crimes investigator, before I retired to a small property outside of Huntsville. My wife Carol passed 4 years ago, breast cancer, fast and merciless, and I've been alone since then in the house we built together on Fairy Lake. I have one son, my boy Daniel, who is 34 years old and works in commercial real estate in Toronto. He is kind and decent, and he trusts people the way his mother did, which is a beautiful thing in a person and a dangerous one. He met his wife 2 years after Carol died. Her name is Gabrielle. She goes by Gabby. And she came into our lives the way a cold front comes in off Georgian Bay. Gradually at first, and then all at once. I want to be honest with you. When Daniel first brought her home, I tried hard not to be the difficult father-in-law. I knew what grief could do to a person's judgment. I knew I might be projecting. Carol had been the one who read people effortlessly, who could tell within 5 minutes of meeting someone whether they were good or not. I was the one who needed evidence. So I told myself to wait for evidence before I decided anything. The first thing I noticed was small. At dinner one evening, about 6 months into their relationship, I mentioned offhand that Carol and I had always kept the lake property in a family trust. Standard estate planning. Gabby asked a few questions, casual, friendly questions about how trusts worked, what happened to the assets if the beneficiaries changed circumstances, whether I'd updated anything since Carol passed. She laughed after each question and said something like, "I'm just curious. I know nothing about this stuff." I gave her easy answers and watched her eyes while I did. The second thing happened at Christmas that year. The first one they spent together in my house up in Huntsville. Gabby excused herself to use the washroom and was gone for nearly 15 minutes. The washroom is on the main floor. My home office is on the main floor, directly across the hallway. I'd been digitizing old case files that week, and my computer had been left open. I didn't say anything. But I changed my passwords that evening after they left, and I started paying attention differently. The third thing, the thing that shifted this from a feeling into something I could no longer dismiss, happened in March, about 8 months before that Thanksgiving dinner. Daniel called me on a Sunday morning, which was unusual. He usually texted. He sounded careful when he spoke, the way he'd sounded as a boy when he was trying to tell me something he was afraid I'd be upset about. He told me that Gabby had been researching investment opportunities, and she'd found something she thought could be really good for the family, a development project in Muskoka. He said she'd been talking to some people and she thought it would be smart to consolidate some assets to take advantage of it, he said. And this is the part where I made myself breathe slowly and evenly. He said Gabby had mentioned that the lake property was probably sitting underutilized, and maybe it was worth thinking about liquidating it and putting the money somewhere it could work harder. Carol and I built that house ourselves. We carried every beam. We planted every tree on that property. Daniel was born 6 weeks after we poured the foundation, and Carol used to joke that the house was his older sibling. I told Daniel I'd think about it. He sounded relieved that I wasn't angry. I thought about it for approximately 4 hours. Then I drove to my storage unit, pulled out the tackle box where I kept my old investigative tools, not much, just habits and instincts and a few subscriptions I'd never canceled, and I started working. It took me 3 weeks to find her first name. It wasn't Gabrielle. Well, it was, technically. Gabrielle was her middle name. Her legal first name was Christine. Christine Gabrielle Marsh, born 1,987 inches, Lethbridge, Alberta, which was interesting because she'd told Daniel she was born in Ottawa and had grown up there, Small lie, maybe. People reinvent their origins all the time, but small lies, in my experience, are usually load-bearing walls for bigger ones. Christine Gabrielle Marsh had a civil judgment against her in Alberta from 2016. A former partner, a man in his late 60s at the time, a retired engineer, had sued her for the recovery of funds transferred from a joint account in the weeks before she ended the relationship. The judgment was for $34,000. It had never been paid. She'd moved to Ontario the following year. I sat with that information for a long time. I thought about Daniel. I thought about how happy he'd seemed. I thought about Carol, who would have known at that first dinner. Who would have pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, "Walter, something's off with that one," in the quiet, certain voice she used when she wasn't guessing. I kept going. The Muskoka development project Gabby had pitched to Daniel did not appear in any business registry I could find. The company name she'd mentioned, Rideau Crest Development Group, had been incorporated federally 6 months earlier. The registered director was a woman named Sandra Okafor. I found Sandra Okafor on LinkedIn. She and Gabby had gone to the same college in Calgary. Sandra Okafor's listed address was a mail forwarding service in Mississauga. I printed everything. I organized it the way I'd organized case files for 31 years, chronological, sourced, cross-referenced. I labeled the folder with Gabby's full legal name and put it in the locked drawer of my desk at home. Then I waited, because a man who spent his career in financial crimes knows that you don't move until your file is complete. You don't move until you have enough that there's no room left to maneuver. The call that moved me came 6 weeks later. Daniel phoned on a Tuesday evening, and this time he didn't sound careful. He sounded excited. He said Gabby had done more research, and the development opportunity had a window they needed to commit by November, or they'd lose their spot. He said he and Gabby had talked it over, and they were thinking of putting in their savings, and they really hoped I'd consider contributing from the lake property proceeds. I asked him how much they were thinking. He told me. It was everything. Every single thing Carol and I had built. I said I'd come down to Toronto that weekend to talk in person. He said that was great. He said Gabby was making her osso buco, my favorite. I hung up and sat in my kitchen in the dark for a while. Through the window I could see the lake, which in October sits very still in the evenings, black and flat and reflecting the tree line. Carol and I used to sit on the dock after dinner. We used to sit there until we got cold, just talking. I wasn't angry, exactly. I want to be precise about this because the emotion I've tried to describe to people since my doctor, my old partner from the OPP, the lawyer who helped me with what came next, the emotion wasn't anger. It was something closer to clarity. The kind of clarity that comes after a long investigation when the last piece slides into place and you finally see the whole shape of what you've been looking at. I called my old partner, a man named Rick Desjardins who'd retired 3 years before me and now did private consulting out of Barrie. I told him what I had. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I'd always valued about Rick. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Walter, this is wire fraud, potentially elder financial abuse, depending on how far it's gone. You need to be talking to someone at the RCMP Economic Crime Unit, not sitting on this." I said I knew that. I said I wasn't going to sit on it much longer, but I needed one more thing. Rick understood. He'd been in the job long enough to understand. What I needed was proof that the money had already started moving. I had a scheme. I had a history. I had a shell company, but I didn't yet have evidence that Daniel's funds specifically were already being redirected. If Gabby was as careful as I suspected, she wouldn't have touched anything until she had my portion committed too. She'd want everything in one clean transaction. So I went to Toronto that weekend. I ate the osso buco. I asked questions about the investment with what I hoped looked like genuine curiosity and mild skepticism, the exact face of a cautious old man being slowly persuaded. Gabby was extraordinary. She was patient and warm, and she had a printed prospectus that looked completely professional. She held Daniel's hand while she talked. She called me Dad twice, which she'd never done before. I told them I wanted to sleep on it. I drove back up to Huntsville that night. 2 weeks after that visit, I called Rick again and asked him to help me access something I no longer had official clearance for. He called in a favor with a contact at the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center. FinTrack, for anyone who doesn't know it, is the federal agency that monitors financial transactions for fraud and money laundering. The contact, without providing anything that would compromise an official investigation, was able to confirm informally that a certain account number 1 that appeared in Gabby's prospectus documents as the receiving account for investor funds had received 2 transfers in the previous 6 weeks. Daniel's savings were already in there. She'd started moving it without telling him. He didn't know yet. I drove to Toronto that Monday. I didn't call ahead. She was home alone. Daniel was at the office. I knocked, and she answered in her yoga clothes, with a smoothie in her hand, and a look of pleasant surprise that became something else very quickly when she saw my face. I didn't go inside. I stood on the front step, and I told her, quietly and completely without dramatics, exactly what I knew: her real name, the Alberta judgment, Sandra Okafor, and the mail forwarding address. The 2 transfers that had already cleared. I told her I had a meeting scheduled with an RCMP economic crime investigator for Thursday morning, and that the only question remaining was what form this would take when it arrived at her door. She was silent through all of it. She was very still. I noticed that her smoothie was trembling slightly in her hand. When I finished, she said, "You can't prove any of this." I said, "I already have." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something that I think was meant to hurt me. She said, "Daniel will never forgive you for this. He loves me. He'll choose me." I thought about Carol. I thought about the way Carol used to say, "Your son is good, Walter, but good people need protecting too." I said, "He might, but you're still going to have to explain it to the RCMP." I left. I sat in my truck around the corner for 40 minutes because I needed to think clearly about what came next, and I didn't want to drive while I was feeling what I was feeling. Then I called Daniel. That was in late October. Thanksgiving was 3 weeks later. Daniel didn't take it well at first. This is the part of the story I want to tell honestly because I've seen versions of these situations. In 30 years of investigations, I'd seen it many times where the victim resists, where the love is strong enough to make a person argue against their own evidence. Daniel did that. He called me that same Monday evening, after Gabby had presumably called him at work. He was upset in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. He said I was jealous of his happiness. He said I'd never given her a fair chance. He said the Alberta thing was a misunderstanding she'd explained to him years ago and he hadn't told me because he knew I'd react like this. I let him talk. When he was done, I said, "Call your bank, son. Check the account where you were holding your investment funds. Then call me back." He called back 47 minutes later. He didn't say much. He asked me to come to Toronto. I drove down that night. I stayed in their guest room. Gabby had left by then, taken a bag to a friend's place, which told me she'd been prepared for this possibility, and Daniel and I sat at his kitchen table until 2 in the morning. I showed him the file, all of it, page by page. I answered every question he had, even the hard ones, even the one where he asked if I'd known for months and hadn't told him, which I had to say yes to, which was the hardest conversation I've ever had with my son. He asked me why I'd waited. I told him the truth. I told him I'd needed enough that she couldn't explain it away. I told him that if I'd come to him with a feeling, with a civil judgment and a hunch, she would have turned it. I told him I needed it to be complete, the way a case needs to be complete before you take it to the Crown. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You should have told me sooner." I said, "You're right. I should have. That's the part I'll carry. There's no version of this where I'm entirely without fault." By the time Thanksgiving arrived, RCMP Economic Crime had opened a formal file. Gabby's lawyer had been in contact with the Crown. Daniel had recovered most of his funds. The transfers had been flagged through FinTrack and partially frozen within days of my Thursday meeting, though the legal process to recover everything was ongoing. Sandra Okafor had been interviewed. The Rideau Crest Development Group had been dissolved. Gabby was still technically living in Daniel's house, in the guest room, because the criminal investigation made it complicated for her to simply leave the province. Her lawyer had advised her to maintain a stable address, which meant she was at Thanksgiving. I want to be clear. Daniel invited her. He and I had talked about it. He felt it was important for reasons I'll explain that she be there. The dinner was at my house in Huntsville. Daniel drove up the morning of, with Gabby, and my sister, Irene, and her husband came from Sudbury. And a couple of Daniel's old friends from university were there, too, good people who knew nothing about any of it. I'd made turkey and Daniel had brought pies from a bakery in Toronto, and Irene brought her pierogies, which she's been making the same way since 1987 and which are the best thing I've ever eaten. It was a good dinner. It was strange and it was good. Gabby sat at the end of the table and spoke when spoken to and ate very little and smiled the careful smile she'd been wearing since October. I watched her when she wasn't looking. I thought about the woman in Alberta, the retired engineer who'd lost $34,000 and had been dismissed as a litigious ex when he tried to warn people. I thought about who else might be in that file that I hadn't found yet. Toward the end of the meal, when the plates were mostly cleared, and Irene was telling a story about something that had happened at her school board job. She's a vice principal in Sudbury. Gabby set down her wine glass and looked across the table. At me, she said, "Walter, I want to say something." The table got a little quieter. She said, "I think you're a very thorough man. I've thought about this a lot, and I want you to know that I actually respect how thorough you are." She paused. She had the composure of someone who'd decided that dignity was the only play remaining. You could have stopped at the first thing you found and gone straight to Daniel. Most people would have. But you waited until you had everything. I looked at her. I said, "That's how investigations work." She said, "Most fathers aren't investigators." I said, "No. Lucky for Daniel that his is." Nobody laughed. Daniel was looking at his plate. Irene's husband was suddenly very interested in the pierogies. Gabby nodded slowly. Then she said, almost to herself, "I underestimated you." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that would have been worth saying. Later, after dinner, when the guests had gone and Daniel was doing dishes and Gabby had gone upstairs, I sat on my dock in the October cold with a cup of coffee and looked at the lake. The water was black, and the trees were mostly bare by then, and the stars were very clear, the way they get in Muskoka when the tourist season is over and the lights go dark. I thought about Carol. I thought about how she would have handled that table. She would have found something kind to say she could always find something kind, even when kindness was difficult, and she would have squeezed Daniel's hand in exactly the right moment. And later in the kitchen, she would have quietly told me what she actually thought, and it would have been more precise and more merciful than anything I was capable of. Daniel came out and sat in the other chair after a while. He brought a blanket because he knew I'd have forgotten to bring one, which is a thing he's been doing since he was about 12. We sat without talking for a long time. He said, "I called the bank again today. They think the full recovery is possible." I said, "I know. Rick told me." He said, "Rick is a good guy." I said, "Best partner I ever had." Another long quiet. An owl, somewhere across the water. The smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's place down the shore. He said, "She told me, back in the spring, that she thought you'd never really accepted her. She said you were looking for reasons not to like her." I said, "I was looking at evidence." He said, "I know that now." I said, "I know you do." He pulled the blanket around him. He looked like he did at 8 years old, sitting on this same dock, when the fish weren't biting, and he didn't want to admit he was tired. He said, "Dad, did you know right away? Like the first time you met her?" I thought about that. I thought about being honest versus being kind, and about how Carol was the one who'd known how to do both at the same time. I said, "I had a feeling. I didn't have anything I could take to you." He said, "That's not what I asked." I looked at him. He was looking at the water. I said, "Yes, pretty much right away." He nodded. He didn't say anything else for a while. Then he said, "Mom would have told you to tell me." I said, "I know that." He said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "Because I learned a long time ago that feelings aren't evidence, and because I was afraid that if I brought you a feeling, you'd walk away from me instead of from her. And I wasn't sure I was wrong to be afraid of that." He was quiet. He leaned over and put his head on my shoulder, the way he hadn't done since Carol's funeral, Since that specific night, when everyone else had gone home, and he'd come and found me sitting in the kitchen, and I'd thought I was supposed to be strong for him, and then he'd just put his head down on my shoulder, and we'd sat like that until morning. He said, "You weren't wrong." I put my arm around him. The lake was still. The stars were out. The cold was the clean kind. The kind you can breathe all the way down. It has been 7 months since Thanksgiving. The criminal case is proceeding through the Ontario court system. Gabby's lawyer has entered a guilty plea to 1 count of fraud over $5,000 in exchange for a reduced charge on the 2nd count, which is still being negotiated. The Alberta victim, the retired engineer whose name is Thomas, who is 71 now and lives in Calgary, has been contacted by the Crown and may be called as a witness to establish pattern of behavior. His civil judgment will likely be addressed as part of sentencing. Daniel recovered 91% of his funds. The remaining 9% is tied up in a civil action against Sandra Okafor, which Rick's contact tells me has a reasonable chance of success. My son is doing what people do after something like this. Some days he's all right. Some days he calls me and doesn't have much to say but calls anyway, which I take as a good sign. He's been talking to someone, a counselor, which I'm glad about. He came up to Huntsville for a weekend in March, and we went ice fishing on the lake, which we hadn't done since he was in his 20s, and he caught 3 pickerel and was insufferable about it in exactly the way I'd hoped. I still get up before 6 most mornings. I walk the property. I drink my coffee on the dock when the weather allows. I've been thinking about taking on some private consulting work, financial crimes, estate fraud, elder financial abuse, because Rick has been on me about it, and because I find I still have the appetite for it. I'm good at it. Carol used to say I was constitutionally incapable of leaving a thing alone once I'd noticed it, which was sometimes a problem in a marriage and is apparently useful in an investigation. I think about her every day, obviously. I think about the fact that she knew things I had to work to know. I think about how much easier the last 2 years would have been with her in the room. But here is the other thing I think about. On the good mornings, when the lake is flat and the light comes through the birches the way it does in spring, I think about Thomas in Calgary, whose name I know because I looked, and who will stand up in an Ontario courtroom and say what happened to him, and who will be believed this time. I think about the account at the chartered bank in Mississauga that FinTrack flagged in November, which led investigators to 2 other potential victims who are now being contacted. I think about the fact that patterns like this one don't usually end with the person they're built on. They end because someone, somewhere, finally took the time to build a complete file. 31 years in financial crimes taught me one thing above everything else. It's not that people are evil. Some are. Most aren't. Most are just opportunistic in ways that compound over time into something that looks like evil from the outside. What it taught me is this: the work matters. The slow, careful, sourced, cross-referenced work, not the feeling, not the hunch. The folder with the name on it, and the page numbers in the corner, and the dates lined up in order. That's what I told Daniel when he asked me, later that winter, whether he should trust people the way he used to. I said, trust people. Trust them fully, the way your mother did. Because a life without that trust is a smaller life, and you don't deserve a smaller life. But learn to ask questions. Learn to pay attention to what the answers actually tell you, not just what you want them to tell you. He asked if he could come up to Huntsville more often this summer. I said the dock was always there. He said he knew. I said come anyway. The lake is open now. The ice went out in early April, earlier than usual. And for a week or 2, the water was a color you only get in Muskoka, in the transition between seasons, not quite winter's gray, not yet summer's green, something in between that Carol used to say looked like the lake was thinking. I sit with my coffee in the mornings and I watch it and I think about all the things that are still unresolved and all the things that are not. I think about Thomas, who is 71 and lives in Calgary and lost $34,000 and will finally, after 9 years, have somewhere to put that story. I think about how sometimes the work of protecting the people you love is invisible to them until it's over. How it happens in truck cabs and storage units, and late-night calls to old partners and printed files in locked drawers. How it looks, from the outside, like an old man who didn't say much, and drove up from Huntsville when asked and ate his dinner and answered questions carefully. How it looks like nothing until it's everything. My name is Walter Kowalski. I'm 67 years old. I live on Fairy Lake, outside of Huntsville, Ontario. My son is going to be all right. That's enough.